Welcome to Pages and Pods. You know, words do not merely describe reality. Repeated often enough by enough people with enough emotional force, they begin to organize reality. A phrase becomes a directive becomes a command becomes a policy, shaping identity, demanding obedience, and enforcing power and control. This podcast asked a simple but dangerous question. How does language become a vessel for domination? And in occult terms, how can repeated language give birth to an egregore? When a culture repeats words like sustainability, footprint, emergency, equity, governance, or the common good, those words no longer function as neutral descriptions. They become charged symbols. They gather emotion, moral pressure, social expectation, and institutional force. Over time, the words begin to think for the people who use them. Ludwig Wittgenstein gives us the first key. In philosophical investigations, he argued that meaning does not live inside a word by itself. Meaning arises from use, from shared practice, from what a community agrees to do with language. As he wrote, it is what human beings say that is true and false, and they agree in the language they use. That is not agreement in opinions, but in form of life. Michel Foucault takes us further by showing that language never circulates in a neutral medium. It moves through unequal power relations, where institutions, experts, media systems, and governing authority shape the boundary of acceptable thought. Whoever controls the dominant discourse does not merely describe reality, but organizes it, deciding which words become legitimate, which ideas become dangerous, and which narratives are treated as truth. The social narrative becomes a way of amplifying political power. In the language of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, this is hegemony, the struggle to control the meaning of keywords, symbols, and social demands so that one political vision becomes to appear natural, moral, and inevitable, where Foucault shows how discourse can discipline and confine thought. Laclau and Mouffe show how political actors reshape meaning itself, linking scattered fears, hopes, and grievances into a unified narrative that changes how people understand the world. But new meanings cannot sustain a movement without a playbook. Counter narratives arise, doubts return, and the spell begins to weaken. Edward Bernays supplied that playbook through modern propaganda, arguing that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society, and describing an invisible government of those who control public opinion, not by open force, but by shaping the unseen mechanisms through which people interpret their freedom, desires, duty, and their truth. That is how language on the physical plane transforms into power and domination. From Wittgenstein, we learn that words gain force through shared use and communal forms of life. From Foucault, we learn that language operates inside unequal power relations where words can discipline, enforce, and confine thought. From Laclau and Mouffe, we learn that language creates hegemony by rallying people around political ideals and fixing meaning around contested symbols. And of course, from Bernays, we learn that consent itself can be engineered. From here, we can begin to see how language, power, propaganda, ritual repetition, and occult thought converge in the creation of egregores, living currents of collective meaning that can guide, inspire, manipulate, and dominate the societies that feed them, where language as spoken and written words act upon the material world. The thoughts that generate language belong, from an esoteric perspective, to the astral plane. In Theosophy and spiritual science, the thoughts behind a slogan, political narrative, or rallying cry are not merely private mental events. They extend into the spiritual realm as thought forms, which writers such as Annie Besant and C.W. Leadbeater describe as visible astral formations of color, shape, force, and intensity, while H.P. Blavatsky describes such forms as active entities that may attract or be entangled with elemental spirits. However, Rudolf Steiner carries the argument further, warning that once a thought form is created, repeated, and believed by the masses, it can become a real danger to humanity. 20th century occultist Robert Ambelain gives us the language to describe how a thought form becomes an egregore. He describes egregores as artificial beings generated by devotion, enthusiasm, or fanaticism. The hearts of the great spiritual currents, good or evil. In this sense, an egregore is not merely an idea, but a vitalized concept, a collective thought form strengthened by repetition, ritual, emotional intensity, and the continual projection of many minds into the same symbolic current. But from my perspective, ritual does not always need to be a consciously occult act. It may appear as a covenant, a compact, public pledge, repeated slogan, institutional policy, or some specific behavior undertaken by large groups of people to perpetuate an idea. At the same time, egregores may also be fed through deliberate occult rituals, formulas, symbols, and invocations. But however the process occurs, repeated acts of compliance, especially when enforced socially, politically, or institutionally, can transform a movement from a shared idea into a vitalized, living egregore in the astral realm. For Steiner, the danger is not merely that thought forms exist, but that the human astral body and intellect can become fields of influence. Lucifer works through the astral plane, inflaming desire, pride, and illusion, while Ahriman clouds the intellect, hardening thoughts into materialism, confusion, and false certainty. Though Steiner never used the term egregore, his description of mass-generated astral thought forms overlaps with what Ambelain later describes as a vitalized collective being, otherwise known as an egregore. If demonic forces can seize or inhabit collective thought forms, then the manipulation of public language becomes more than propaganda. It becomes a possible channel through which spiritual powers manifest in social reality. This raises an unsettling question. Do those who control narratives and impose propaganda understand the forces they are serving? Do they consciously cultivate these relationships, or are they themselves deluded instruments, unconscious participants enjoying the temporary power offered by Luciferic and Ahrimanic influences? Regardless, when powerful narratives of control and domination are enforced upon the public, and the public concedes to them, accepts them, and repeats them, and performs the prescribed actions attached to them, an egregore is formed. In occult terms, the collective idea becomes vitalized and a pathway is fixed through which luciferic, aramonic, and demonic forces may manifest directly into the human world. Well, if you got this far, I hope you really enjoyed this. I enjoyed saying it, and I would really enjoy if you'd subscribe because it makes me feel good. So with that, be careful of what you agree with in the public sphere.